February 14, 1945. The island of Iwo Jima lay beneath a sky heavy with smoke and the metallic scent of cordite. In the volcanic ash that covered the island like a gray shroud, a young Japanese soldier named Corporal Yamamoto Kenji pressed his body into a shell crater, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Blood seeped through the makeshift bandage on his thigh, darkening the fabric of his uniform. Around him, the sound of artillery fire rolled across the black sand beaches like distant thunder, punctuated by the sharp crack of rifle fire and the screams of wounded men in both Japanese and English. He had been taught that the American Marines were devils, barbarous creatures who took no prisoners and showed no mercy. He had been told that to surrender was to embrace a shame worse than death itself, that capture meant torture and humiliation beyond imagination. As his vision began to blur and the world tilted sideways, he heard voices approaching through the smoke. American voices. His hand moved weakly toward the grenade at his belt, prepared to fulfill his final duty. But what happened in the next few moments would shatter everything he had been taught to believe about his enemy, and plant the first seed of a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What if everything he had been told was a lie? The story of how Japanese soldiers came to be shocked by American compassion toward their wounded is not merely a tale of battlefield mercy. It is a story that reaches back into the fundamental ideologies that shaped two nations on opposite sides of the Pacific, two cultures that had been set on a collision course by forces of history, economics, and radically different visions of human worth. To understand the profound impact of these encounters between wounded Japanese soldiers and their American captors, one must first understand the vast chasm that separated not just their armies, but their entire worldviews about duty, honor, and the value of individual human life. The Empire of Japan that entered World War II was a nation built upon centuries of warrior tradition, Bushido philosophy, and a carefully constructed mythology that placed the emperor at the center of a divine hierarchy. From the Meiji Restoration of 1868 through the militaristic expansion of the 1930s, Japanese society had been systematically molded to value collective sacrifice above individual survival, national glory above personal comfort, and death before dishonor. The education system, from elementary schools to military academies, instilled in young Japanese men the belief that their lives belonged not to themselves, but to the emperor and the nation. To die in service to Japan was the highest honor. To be captured was an unforgivable disgrace that brought shame not only upon the soldier, but upon his entire family for generations. This was not mere propaganda, though propaganda certainly reinforced it. This was a worldview woven into the fabric of Japanese culture through Shinto religious beliefs, Confucian social hierarchy, and the samurai code that had governed warrior conduct for centuries. The Senjin-kun, or Instructions for the Battlefield, issued by War Minister Tojo Hideki in January 1941, made this explicit. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure that you do not leave behind a name soiled by disgrace. These were not empty words. They represented a fundamental principle that would lead to some of the most shocking aspects of the Pacific War, from kamikaze attacks to the mass suicides of Japanese civilians on Saipan, and from the death marches of Allied prisoners to the fierce resistance of Japanese soldiers who fought literally, to the last man on island after island. The Japanese military indoctrination process was thorough and brutal. New recruits were subjected to systematic beatings, designed not just to instill discipline but to dehumanize them, to break down their individual identity and remake them as instruments of imperial will. They were taught that the enemy, particularly the Americans, were subhuman monsters who would commit unspeakable atrocities if given the chance. Captured Allied pilots were paraded through streets and subjected to public humiliation. Stories of American brutality, some true, many exaggerated or fabricated, circulated through the ranks. The message was clear and constant. Capture meant a fate worse than death. Better to die with honor than to face what awaited in enemy hands. Meanwhile, across the Pacific Ocean, the United States military operated under an entirely different philosophy. American soldiers were citizen soldiers, drawn from a democratic society that, despite its own contradictions and injustices, placed theoretical value on individual human rights and the dignity of human life. The United States was a signatory to the Geneva Conventions of 1929, which established rules for the treatment of prisoners of war. American military training emphasized that enemy combatants who surrendered or were incapacitated by wounds were to be treated humanely, given medical care, and protected from harm. This was not just idealism. It was codified in military law and reinforced. Through training and the military justice system, the contrast between these two systems would prove stark and shocking when they collided on the battlefields of the Pacific. American Marines and soldiers, products of a society that valued individual life and recognized the humanity even in enemies, would encounter Japanese soldiers who had been psychologically prepared to die rather than surrender, who expected torture and execution if captured, and who could not comprehend the concept of an enemy who would risk his own life to save theirs. The Pacific War, from its beginning with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, through the island-hopping campaigns that would follow, would become one of the most brutal theaters of the Second World War. The fighting was characterized by ferocious close-quarters combat, suicidal banzai charges, and a mutual incomprehension that made the conflict particularly savage. In the early stages of the war, very few Japanese soldiers allowed themselves to be captured. On Guadalcanal in the Philippines, on Tarawa and Kwajalein, Japanese forces fought with a fanatical determination that stunned American troops. Wounded Japanese soldiers would often use their last strength to detonate grenades when American medics approached, killing both themselves and their would-be rescuers. The practice became so common that American forces learned to be extremely cautious around wounded or apparently dead Japanese soldiers. Yet even in this environment of mutual suspicion and violence, something remarkable began to happen. American forces, again and again, when presented with wounded Japanese soldiers who could no longer fight, made the choice to treat them with a humanity that defied both the brutality of the combat environment and the warnings they had received about Japanese treachery. And when Japanese soldiers survived these encounters and found themselves receiving medical care rather than execution, food rather than torture, and treatment as human beings rather than as animals, the psychological impact was profound and disorienting. Corporal Yamamoto had grown up in a small farming village in Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands. His father had been a veteran of the war in China, a taciturn man who spoke little of what he had seen, but who instilled in his son the absolute importance of duty and sacrifice. When Yamamoto received his draft notice in 1943, his mother had wept, but his father had presented him with a senninbari, a 1,000-stitch belt sewn by 1,000 different women as a talisman of protection and a reminder of the nation's prayers for his service. He had trained in Manchuria, where the cold was so bitter that men lost fingers and toes to frostbite during winter exercises. He had been beaten by his sergeants, had beaten the recruits who came after him, and had learned to suppress every individual thought and desire in service to the emperor's will. When he shipped out to the Pacific Islands in early 1945, Yamamoto believed himself ready to die. He had written his death poem and sent it home to his family. He had prayed at the shrine and prepared his spirit for the final sacrifice. What he had not prepared for, what no amount of training could have prepared him for, was survival after defeat. The wound in his leg had come from shrapnel during an American artillery barrage. He had crawled into the crater during a break in the bombing, knowing that the Americans would soon advance through this sector. He had his rifle, though he had only 3 rounds left. He had his bayonet. He had his grenade. He would take at least one American devil with him when they came. But as he lay in that crater, bleeding and weak, feeling his life draining away into the volcanic soil, a strange thing happened. The voices that approached through the smoke were shouting, but not in the aggressive war cries he had expected. They were calling out in broken Japanese, "Yamete! Yamete kudasai! No shoot! No shoot! Medic! Medic!" And then faces appeared above the rim of the crater, faces smudged with ash and sweat. Young faces, some younger than his own, and they were not pointing weapons at him, but rather scrambling down into the crater with raised hands, one of them wearing a helmet with a red cross painted on it. Yamamoto's hand trembled on the grenade. This must be a trick. They would take his weapons, and then the torture would begin. Everything he had been taught screamed at him to pull the pin, to take these Americans with him into death. But he was so tired, so weak from blood loss, and some part of his mind, the part that had not been fully subsumed by military indoctrination, the part that still remembered his mother's tears and the smell of rice fields in spring, made his fingers release their grip on the grenade. The American medic reached him first, hands moving quickly and efficiently, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of his uniform around the wound, speaking in a calm, steady stream of English that Yamamoto could not understand but whose tone carried no malice, no cruelty. Another Marine had taken Yamamoto's weapons, yes, but carefully, almost respectfully, setting them aside rather than keeping them pointed at their wounded enemy. And then the medic was cleaning the wound, which sent lightning bolts of pain through Yamamoto's leg that made him cry out, despite himself. But the medic was saying something, making soothing sounds. And then there was the sharp sting of a needle, and the pain began to recede. Replaced by a strange floating sensation, they were giving him morphine. The Americans were giving medical supplies, precious medical supplies, to an enemy soldier who had been trying to kill them moments before. Yamamoto's mind reeled with the impossibility of it. He had seen Japanese medical corpsmen forced to choose which wounded soldiers might be saved, and which would be left to die because supplies were so limited. He had seen men in agony refused pain medication because it was being conserved for soldiers who had a better chance of returning to combat. Yet here was an American, using his supplies, his time, his skill, to save the life of a Japanese soldier who would never fight for America, who had been his enemy and might be his enemy again. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, as they carried him through the smoke and ash toward the American lines, Yamamoto's thoughts were a confused jumble. He felt shame at being captured, shame at having failed to die as he was supposed to. But alongside that, shame was something else, something he had no framework to understand. These Americans, these supposed devils and barbarians, had shown him a kindness that he had never experienced even from his own officers. They had treated his life as something of value, when his own military had treated him as an expendable tool. This was the emotional earthquake that struck Japanese soldiers when they encountered American medical treatment and prisoner of war protocols. They had expected death or torture. They had been psychologically prepared for the worst imaginable treatment. Instead, they found themselves in field hospitals receiving the same medical care that American wounded received, eating food that was more plentiful and better quality than what they had eaten even before being wounded, and being treated by their captors with a basic human decency that contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. The documented accounts of these encounters are numerous and consistent in their testimony to the profound psychological impact on Japanese prisoners. In the archives of the United States Marine Corps, there are after-action reports from Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and other battles that make specific mention of the challenges and successes in convincing wounded Japanese soldiers to accept medical help. A report from the 5th Marine Division on Iwo Jima notes, wounded enemy soldiers initially resist medical aid, often attempting suicide or attacking corpsmen. However, once treatment is begun and the soldier realizes no harm is intended, resistance typically ceases and cooperation increases. Several prisoners have expressed surprise and confusion at receiving medical treatment. Dr. Harold Wise, a Navy surgeon who served with Marine forces throughout the Pacific Campaign, kept detailed journals that were later published. In an entry from March 1945, he wrote, "Today we treated 14 Japanese wounded, 3 of them critical. The contradictions in their behavior are striking. They resist aid initially with what seems like genuine terror, but once they understand they are to be helped rather than harmed, many break down emotionally. One young soldier, barely 20 years old, wept openly when given morphine and had his wounds dressed. Through our interpreter, he said he had been told we would torture him and that death was preferable to capture. The look in his eyes when he realized this was not true was something I will never forget. A mixture of relief, confusion, and what I can only describe as a kind of betrayal, as though his entire worldview had been shattered. The cultural and ideological shock went beyond mere medical treatment. Japanese prisoners of war were held in camps that, while certainly not luxurious and certainly subject to some of the racism and prejudice of the era, were operated according to Geneva Convention protocols that the Japanese military itself did not follow. Prisoners received regular meals, medical care, opportunities for recreation, and treatment that acknowledged their basic human dignity. For soldiers who had been raised in a military system where beatings were routine and where superiors held absolute power over subordinates, the American approach to discipline and prisoner management was bewildering. Allied translator and interpreter. Service interrogation reports contain numerous accounts of prisoners expressing shock at American material abundance. One report from a prisoner captured on Saipan in June 1944 notes, "The prisoner stated that he could not understand why America was fighting for more territory when Americans clearly had everything they needed." He observed that even American prisoners, meaning wounded Americans in the field hospital where he was being treated, ate better food than Japanese officers. He expressed particular amazement at the waste of food he observed, with partially eaten meals being discarded, and stated that in the Japanese military, such waste would result in severe punishment. This observation about food would become a recurring theme in prisoner testimonies. The American military logistics system, the greatest the world had ever seen, ensured that even frontline troops received relatively varied and nutritious rations. Japanese forces, by contrast, were frequently on the edge of starvation, their supply lines interdicted by American submarines and aircraft. On islands like Guadalcanal and New Guinea, Japanese soldiers had resorted to eating grass, roots, and tree bark. Many died of malnutrition and diseases related to starvation. When these men, or survivors from similar situations, encountered American mess facilities or even sea ration provisions, the contrast was almost incomprehensible. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Keene, who served as a translator and interrogator in the Pacific, and later became a renowned scholar of Japanese literature and culture, wrote extensively about these encounters. In his memoir, he recounted the story of a Japanese officer captured on Okinawa who initially refused to eat, believing the food was poisoned or that accepting it would be dishonorable. After watching American guards and other prisoners eat the same food without ill effect, he finally accepted a meal. Keene wrote, "He ate slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. When he finished, he sat motionless for several minutes, then asked through the interpreter if he could have more. I authorized another serving. After eating, he asked to speak to me privately. Through the interpreter, he said something that struck me deeply. I have been lied to about everything. If they lied about this, what else was a lie?" It was the beginning of his long process of psychological reconstruction. The Diaries of Eugene Sledge, a Marine who fought on Peleliu and Okinawa, and later wrote the acclaimed memoir With the Old Breed, contains several passages about the treatment of Japanese wounded. Sledge, whose book is notable for its unflinching honesty about the brutality of combat, also documented moments of humanity. He described an incident on Okinawa where a Japanese soldier badly burned by a flamethrower was found in a cave. Despite the protests of some Marines who argued he should be left to die or finished off, a Navy corpsman insisted on treating his wounds and evacuating him. Sledge wrote, "I don't know if that Jap survived. The burns were terrible, but watching Doc work on him with the same care he'd shown to our own wounded boys, I understood something about why we were fighting. It wasn't that we were perfect or that we didn't do brutal things. We did. But there was something in us, or in our system, that still recognized a suffering human being as human, even when he was the enemy. I don't think the Japanese military had that, and that difference mattered." Statistical records support these anecdotal accounts. According to U.S. military records, approximately 41,000 Japanese servicemen were taken prisoner during the Pacific War, out of millions who served. This extremely low number reflects the Japanese military's emphasis on death before surrender. However, of those who were captured, Survival rates in American custody were relatively high, especially compared to the fate of Allied prisoners in Japanese hands, where approximately 27% of Allied prisoners of war held by Japan died in captivity. Fewer than 5% of Japanese prisoners died in American custody, and most of those deaths were from wounds sustained before capture or from illness contracted before capture. The psychological impact of captivity was documented through extensive interrogation programs. The Office of War Information and the Allied Translator and Interpreter Service conducted thousands of interviews with Japanese prisoners. These interviews revealed common patterns: initial expectation of execution or torture, shock at humane treatment, gradual willingness to cooperate and provide information, and in many cases, a fundamental questioning of the ideology they had been taught. Some prisoners became so disillusioned with the Japanese military system that they volunteered to assist in the American war effort, broadcasting surrender appeals to their former comrades or providing tactical intelligence. The transformation that occurred in the minds of Japanese soldiers who experienced American medical care and POW treatment was not instantaneous, nor was it universal. Some prisoners remained committed to their original ideology, viewing their capture as an irrevocable shame that no amount of kind treatment could erase. But for many, the cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught to expect and what they actually experienced created a psychological crisis that forced a fundamental reassessment of their beliefs. Corporal Yamamoto, lying in a hospital bed in a U.S. Navy field hospital on Guam, found himself in a world that made no sense according to his previous understanding. The wound in his leg was clean and bandaged. He had been given antibiotics, a miracle of American medicine that prevented the infection that would almost certainly have killed him otherwise. He was fed 3 times a day, meals that included meat, rice, vegetables, even desserts. The American guards, while watchful, were not cruel. They did not beat him. They did not torture him. When he needed to use the latrine, they assisted him. When he was in pain, they gave him medication. Around him in the ward were other Japanese wounded, and Yamamoto listened to their whispered conversations in the night. Some spoke of shame and dishonor. Others spoke of confusion. One man, a veteran sergeant who had fought in China, said something that struck Yamamoto deeply. "I killed Chinese civilians. I participated in executions of prisoners. I believed we were superior, that our cause was just, that the emperor's will justified everything. But if the Americans, whom we called barbarians, can show mercy to their enemies, what does that make us who showed none?" This question haunted the ward. It hung in the air alongside the smell of antiseptic and the sounds of wounded men from both sides, receiving care from American medical personnel, who made no distinction in the quality of treatment based on nationality. The Americans had doctors and nurses who were trained professionals, who had taken oaths to preserve life, and who did so without regard to whether that life belonged to friend or foe. This concept was alien to men who had been part of a military system where medical resources were scarce and allocated according to a brutal calculus of utility to the war effort. The transformation was not just about medical care. It was about encountering a different way of thinking about human value and human rights. American guards would sometimes make conversation through interpreters. They would show photographs of their families, their homes, their lives before the war. They would ask the Japanese prisoners about their own families and homes. This simple act of recognizing the shared humanity between enemy soldiers was revolutionary for men who had been indoctrinated to see the enemy as subhuman demons. One American nurse, Lieutenant Mary Sullivan, worked in the field hospital on Guam throughout 1945. In letters home that were preserved by her family, she described the experience of treating Japanese wounded. "They are so young, many of them, younger than my own brothers. When they first arrive, they are terrified, and some try to refuse treatment, preferring to die. But once they understand that we are truly here to help them, you can see something change in their eyes. It's like they are seeing the world differently for the first time." One boy, he couldn't have been more than 18, asked the interpreter why we were helping him when he had been trying to kill Americans just hours before. I told him it was because every life has value regardless of which uniform it wears. The interpreter said the boy had no word in his language for that concept, at least not as applied to enemies. That broke my heart. The transformation extended beyond individual prisoners to influence broader Japanese understanding of American character and values. Some prisoners were allowed to participate in educational programs where they learned about American history, democracy, and the principles underlying American society. These programs were partly propaganda efforts, certainly, but they also exposed Japanese prisoners to ideas about individual rights, freedom of speech, and democratic governance that were genuinely different from the authoritarian imperial system they had known. As the war progressed and more Japanese soldiers were captured, particularly in the final months of the fighting on Okinawa, the network of prisoner experiences began to create a body of evidence that contradicted official Japanese propaganda. Surrender leaflets dropped by American aircraft included testimonials from Japanese prisoners describing their treatment. While Japanese military authorities dismissed these as lies and propaganda, and while soldiers were ordered to destroy the leaflets without reading them, some did read them, and some found themselves wondering if perhaps there was truth in what they said. The transformation was not always positive or complete. Some prisoners experienced what psychologists would later recognize as a form of trauma. Their entire value system collapsed, leaving them adrift without a clear sense of identity or purpose. The shame of capture, so deeply ingrained in their cultural and military training, remained a heavy burden. Many prisoners believed they could never return to Japan, could never face their families again. Some requested that the Americans inform their families that they had been killed in action rather than captured. The psychological wounds of ideological collapse were, in some ways, as severe as any physical injury. Yet for many, there was also a sense of liberation, a recognition that they had been freed not just from combat, but from a system that had valued their lives only as tools to be used and discarded. In the POW camps, Japanese prisoners began to form communities, to rediscover aspects of their humanity that military service had suppressed. They held religious services, wrote poetry, created art, studied English, and debated among themselves the meaning of what they had experienced and what Japan's future might hold. Throughout the testimonies of Japanese prisoners, one object appears again and again as a symbol of the vast gulf between American and Japanese material reality and, by extension, between their different conceptions of human worth. The sea ration can. This simple item, a tin can containing preserved food designed to provide a complete meal for one American soldier, became for Japanese prisoners an emblem of American abundance and the value American society placed on the individual soldier's well-being. The sea ration, developed in 1938 and refined throughout the war, was a marvel of food science and industrial production. Each ration contained meat, biscuits, sugar, soluble coffee, and even cigarettes and toilet paper. American soldiers often complained about sea rations, finding them monotonous and unappetizing compared to fresh food. But to Japanese soldiers, many of whom had been subsisting on a handful of rice per day, supplemented by whatever they could forage, a sea ration represented wealth beyond imagination. In prisoner testimony after testimony, the sea ration appears as a moment of revelation. One prisoner, a private captured on Iwo Jima, described his first encounter with a sea ration in his interrogation interview. "The American guard gave me this metal box. Inside was more food than I had eaten in 3 days. There was meat in a tin, and hard bread and small packages of items I did not recognize. The guard showed me how to open each component. I ate slowly because my stomach had shrunk from hunger. When I finished, I felt full for the first time in months. I looked at the empty tins and packages, and the guard, through gestures, indicated I should throw them away. Throw them away! These containers, which could be used for so many purposes, treated as waste. This single meal for one American soldier represented more resources than were allocated to feed 10 Japanese soldiers. At that moment, I understood that we could not win this war. We were fighting an enemy that valued each individual soldier so much that they ensured he was well fed even in combat. Our military treated us as expendable. The sea ration became a symbol that prisoners would reference when trying to explain to new captors what they had learned about America. "Remember the metal boxes," they would say. "Remember that the Americans consider this ordinary, unremarkable. They produce these by the millions. They feed every soldier like this. Think about what that means about their industrial capacity. Think about what it means about how they value their soldiers' lives." But the symbolism went deeper than material abundance. The sea ration represented a fundamental philosophical difference. American military logistics were built on the principle that a well-fed, well-supplied soldier was an effective soldier, and that effectiveness served the mission. But beneath that utilitarian calculation was a deeper assumption, that soldiers were citizens in uniform, individuals whose well-being mattered not just for military effectiveness, but as an end in itself. The American citizen soldier was not a tool to be used until broken and discarded. He was a person with inherent value, a man who would return home after the war and resume his life in civil society. The Japanese military philosophy was different. Soldiers were expected to endure hardship without complaint. Suffering was considered character building. Complaints about food, living conditions, or other hardships were viewed as weakness and disloyalty. The Japanese soldier was taught that he had no existence separate from his military role, no individual needs or desires that mattered. He was an extension of the emperor's will, and his purpose was to serve that will until death. When Japanese prisoners encountered not just the sea ration, but the entire American system of supply and support that it represented, they were confronting a different answer to the fundamental question of what a human being is worth. The American answer, imperfect and contradictory as it was in a society that still practiced racial segregation and denied full citizenship to many of its own people, nonetheless contained within it a recognition of individual human value that the Japanese military system lacked. Corporal Yamamoto, in the POW camp on Guam, received his daily rations and found himself thinking about his family's farm in Kyushu. They had struggled every year to produce enough rice to feed themselves and meet the requisitions demanded by the government. His mother had often gone hungry so that her children could eat. He had joined the military partly because it meant one less mouth for his family to feed. Now here he was, an enemy prisoner, being fed more than he could eat, while his family back home was certainly hungry, perhaps starving. The injustice of it was staggering, but even more staggering was the realization that this abundance was not an accident or a temporary condition. America produced food in such quantities that feeding prisoners well was not considered a significant expense. The nation was so wealthy that it could afford to be generous even to its enemies. This realization led to another. If America had so much, why was it at war with Japan? Japanese propaganda had claimed that America was fighting to suppress Japan's legitimate expansion, to deny Japan access to resources it needed to survive, to maintain Western colonial dominance over Asia. But if America had such abundance, what did it need from Japan? The official narrative began to crumble under the weight of observable reality. The sea ration can, in the hands of Japanese prisoners, became something more than food container. It became a teaching tool, a symbol of a different world, a catalyst for questioning everything they had been taught. Some prisoners kept empty sea ration cans as talismans, as physical proof of what they had experienced. Years later, after the war, some of these cans would be carried back to Japan by repatriated prisoners, tangible evidence of the abundance they had witnessed, conversation starters for difficult discussions about what Japan had become and what it might become in the future. The sun set over the Pacific Ocean in colors of orange and purple, painting the waves with light that seemed to stretch infinitely toward the horizon. In a hospital ward on Guam, Corporal Yamamoto Kenji sat on the edge of his bed, his wounded leg healing, his mind wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Tomorrow, he had been told through an interpreter, he would be transferred to a larger POW facility in Hawaii, and from there, eventually, to a camp in the United States mainland. He would spend the rest of the war as a prisoner, and then, if he survived, he would face the terrifying prospect of returning to a Japan that would almost certainly view him as a shameful disgrace. But tonight, he thought about the American medic who had saved his life in that shell crater on Iwo Jima. He did not know that man's name. He had never been able to properly thank him, had never been able to explain that his act of mercy had not just saved a life, but had shattered a worldview and planted the seeds of understanding that would grow in the years to come. That nameless medic, acting in accordance with training and values he probably took for granted, had demonstrated a truth more powerful than any propaganda, that there are principles larger than nationalism, values deeper than ideology, and a common humanity that transcends the uniforms of war. The story of Japanese soldiers shocked by American treatment of their wounded is, in the end, a story about the power of human decency to cross even the deepest divides. It is a story about how actions speak louder than propaganda, how lived experience trumps indoctrination, and how the simple act of treating an enemy as a human being can shake the foundations of absolute belief. These encounters in field hospitals and POW camps, these moments when wounded Japanese soldiers confronted the gap between what they had been taught and what they experienced, represented something profound about the nature of the conflict in the Pacific and about the different visions of human society that were at war. The American forces who provided medical care to enemy wounded were not saints or angels. They were ordinary men and women, products of a flawed society with its own deep contradictions and injustices. Many harbored prejudice against the Japanese. Many had lost friends and comrades to Japanese bullets and bombs. The brutality of the Pacific War had hardened many hearts. Yet even in that environment of mutual slaughter, the institutional structures and cultural values of American democracy created space for mercy, mandated humane treatment of prisoners, and recognized that enemy soldiers were still human beings entitled to certain fundamental rights. This was not idealism overcoming reality. This was idealism embedded in policy, codified in regulations, enforced through military law and practiced, imperfectly but consistently, across thousands of encounters between American forces and Japanese wounded. The Geneva Conventions were not just words on paper. They were translated into field manuals, taught in training, and reinforced by officers who understood that how an army treats its enemies reflects what that army is fighting for. The Japanese military had rejected the Geneva Conventions, had built its entire system on a philosophy that denied individual human value in favor of collective sacrifice to the state, and had created through systematic indoctrination and brutal discipline an army of men prepared to die but not prepared to encounter mercy. When that army collided with American forces operating under different principles, the result was a profound cognitive dissonance that affected thousands of Japanese prisoners and, through them, began to filter back into Japanese society's understanding of what had happened during the war and why it had ended in catastrophic defeat. After the war, some Japanese veterans who had been prisoners of the Americans spoke about their experiences, though many remained silent out of shame. Those who did speak often focused on the contrast between the America they had been taught to hate and fear and the America they had actually encountered. They spoke of field hospitals where Japanese wounded received the same care as American wounded. They spoke of POW camps where they were treated as human beings. They spoke of meals that were abundant, of guards who were professional rather than sadistic, of a system that, despite all its flaws and despite the racism that certainly existed, nonetheless operated on principles that recognized a baseline of human dignity even for enemies. These testimonies contributed to Japan's complex post-war reckoning with its wartime ideology and actions. They provided evidence, difficult to dismiss because it came from Japanese sources, that the narrative of American barbarism had been false propaganda. They raised uncomfortable questions about the Japanese military's treatment of Allied prisoners, about the atrocities committed in China and across Asia, about the fundamental assumptions that had led Japan down the path to war and destruction. If the Americans, whom Japanese propaganda had portrayed as racially inferior and morally corrupt, had shown humanity and mercy, what did that say about Japan's own conduct? What did it say about the ideology that had justified such conduct? There are no simple lessons to be drawn from these encounters between wounded Japanese soldiers and their American captors. War remained war, brutal and terrible. American forces committed atrocities, took few prisoners in some battles, and operated in an environment where racial hatred was common. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would visit destruction on a scale that dwarfed any mercy shown on individual battlefields. The story is not one of American moral superiority, but rather one of how different systemic approaches to human value played out in the intimate context of caring for wounded enemies. What emerges from the testimonies and records is a picture of how ideas matter, how the philosophical foundations of a society shape the actions of individuals within that society, and how those actions accumulate to create patterns that reveal deeper truths. The American democracy that fought World War II was flawed and imperfect, still grappling with the legacy of slavery and the reality of segregation, still denying full rights to women and minorities. Yet within its imperfections, it carried forward certain ideas about individual rights and human dignity that had practical consequences on the battlefield. Those ideas were embedded in military regulations about treatment of prisoners, in training for medical personnel, in the logistical systems that ensured abundant supplies, even for enemies under care. The Japanese empire that fought World War II was built on different ideas about collective subordination to the state, about racial and cultural superiority, about the glorification of death and the shame of survival. Those ideas, too, had practical consequences, shaping how soldiers viewed themselves and their enemies, how officers treated their subordinates, how the entire military system valued or devalued human life. When these two systems collided, when wounded Japanese soldiers found themselves in the care of American medics and doctors, the clash was not just between armies but between philosophies. And for many of those wounded soldiers, lying in field hospitals or POW camp infirmaries, being treated with a kindness they had not expected and had been taught not to trust, the experience became a doorway to understanding that their entire worldview had been constructed on lies. Corporal Yamamoto would survive the war. He would be repatriated to Japan in 1946, returning to a country devastated by defeat, occupied by the same Americans who had captured and cared for him. He would never speak to his family about his capture and captivity, carrying that shame in silence for the rest of his life. But he would also carry with him the memory of that American medic in the shell crater, the image of those hands working to save an enemy's life, and the profound question that experience had planted in his mind. If everything he had been taught about the enemy was a lie, what other lies had he believed? What other truths had been kept from him? That question, multiplied across thousands of Japanese prisoners who had similar experiences, multiplied further across a defeated nation, trying to understand how it had arrived at such catastrophe, would contribute to Japan's remarkable post-war transformation. The nation that had glorified death and conquest would become a nation committed to peace. The military culture that had treated individual lives as worthless would give way to a democratic society that enshrined human rights in its constitution. That transformation had many causes, many architects, many dimensions. But among those dimensions, small and often unacknowledged, were the countless individual encounters, where American humanity toward Japanese prisoners demonstrated that another way was possible. The shock that Japanese soldiers felt when Americans saved their wounded was the shock of encountering grace where they expected destruction, mercy where they expected cruelty, recognition of their humanity where they expected only hatred. It was the shock of discovering that the world was larger and more complex than their ideology had allowed them to see, that enemies could act with honor, that the value of a human life was not determined by nationality or loyalty, but was inherent and universal. In those shell craters and field hospitals, in those moments when American medics risked their own lives to save Japanese wounded, in those POW camps where enemy soldiers were treated as human beings.
June 11th, 1942. Naval Air Station North Island, San Diego, California. The morning fog rolled thick across the airfield as three men stood before a machine that should not have existed on American soil. Their breath came visible in the early coastal chill, mingling with the salt air and aviation fuel. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders placed his hand against the aluminum skin of the aircraft before him, feeling the coolness of the metal, the slight texture of rivets beneath his palm. The fighter gleamed under the diffused sunlight breaking through marine layer clouds, its paint still bearing the scars of combat, bullet holes patched hastily with American aluminum. The red circles of the rising sun had been covered with white paint and overlaid with the blue star of the United States Navy, but everyone present knew what this machine truly was. A Mitsubishi A6M2 Type 0 fighter, intact, captured, and about to reveal its secrets. Sanders stepped back, his eyes tracing the lines of the aircraft from propeller to tail. Clean, almost disturbingly elegant. The wings stretched impossibly long for a fighter, giving it a graceful predatory appearance like a raptor frozen mid-dive. Next to him, Lieutenant Bud Sutherland, a combat-tested pilot who had faced these machines over Wake Island, stood with his arms crossed, his jaw set in a mixture of curiosity and residual fear. He had watched friends die screaming toward the ocean in flames while these machines danced untouchable through the sky. And beside him, Commander John Lundstrom, intelligence officer, held a clipboard thick with preliminary reports, intercepted Japanese communications, and pilot testimonies that all said the same impossible thing. This aircraft could outmaneuver anything America had put into the sky. The hangar behind them buzzed with activity. Engineers, test pilots, intelligence analysts, all converging on this single artifact of war. Somewhere in the Pacific, men were dying in dogfights against machines identical to this one. Somewhere carriers burned and pilots drowned. But here, in this moment, on this fog-wrapped California morning, America had finally caught the ghost. They would tear it apart, study it, learn from it, and perhaps if fortune smiled, find its weakness. Because wars are not won by courage alone, but by understanding the enemy's sword better than he understands it himself. Sanders pulled open the cockpit canopy, which slid back with surprising smoothness. The interior greeted him with stark simplicity. No armor plating behind the pilot's seat. No self-sealing fuel tanks. No heavy bulletproof glass. Just thin aluminum, canvas, and the barest instruments necessary to fly and kill. He ran his hand along the seat back, feeling nothing but the fabric cover over a metal frame. His fingers found no steel, no protection. A .30 caliber round would pass through this like paper. A .50 caliber would obliterate it. Yet this machine had terrorized the Pacific for 7 months. Had swept American fighters from the sky over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Wake Island, and a dozen other battlefields whose names were still being written in blood. How? The question hung in the cool morning air like the fog itself. How had Japanese engineers, working with less industrial capacity than Detroit alone, with fewer resources than a single American state, created something that defied every principle of American fighter design? American fighters were armored, protected, built to absorb punishment and bring their pilots home. American fighters carried heavy weapons, multiple machine guns, cannon in some cases, enough firepower to shred an enemy in a single burst. American fighters were powerful, their engines roaring with more than 1,000 horsepower, dragging their weight through the sky by sheer mechanical force. But this machine before them represented a different philosophy entirely. A philosophy written not in steel, but in air itself. To understand what Sanders and his team discovered that June morning, one must first understand what American fighter pilots expected when they went to war in December 1941. The United States Navy's primary carrier fighter was the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, a stubby, pugnacious machine that looked like its namesake, compact and tough. The Wildcat weighed 6,000 pounds empty, could reach about 330 miles per hour in level flight, and could absorb tremendous punishment. Its armor plating protected the pilot from behind and below. Its self-sealing fuel tanks meant that even when hit, fire was less likely. Its 650 caliber machine guns could tear an enemy aircraft apart. It was built on the American principle that had won the First World War: armor, firepower, and the industrial capacity to replace losses. The Army Air Corps flew the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, a fighter with similar philosophy. Heavy, armored, armed with 6 50-caliber guns, capable of tremendous diving speeds, built to take damage and keep fighting. American pilots trained to use these advantages. They learned to dive on enemies from above, use their weight and speed to strike and escape, to absorb return fire and rely on their armor to survive. The manuals were clear: maintain altitude, maintain speed, attack with single devastating passes. Do not attempt to turn fight with more agile opponents. But the Zero had made these tactics difficult, sometimes impossible. Since the first day of the Pacific War, American pilots returned with stories that seemed fantastical, impossible. Japanese fighters that could turn inside any American aircraft, that could climb faster than seemed physically possible, that appeared at altitudes American fighters struggled to reach, that danced through the sky as if gravity itself had released its hold. Pilots reported emptying their guns at a Zero, only to watch it roll gracefully away untouched, then whip around and appear on their tail before they could complete their own turn. The intelligence reports compiled through the spring of 1942 painted a terrifying picture. Over Pearl Harbor, Zeros had achieved near total air superiority, shooting down or destroying on the ground the majority of American fighters with minimal losses. Over the Philippines, experienced Army Air Corps pilots found themselves outclassed in nearly every engagement. Wake Island's defenders, flying obsolete Wildcats, managed to down a few Zeros through desperate tactics and sheer determination, but the outcome was never in doubt. At the Battle of the Java Sea, Zeros escorted their bombers with impunity, swatting aside Allied fighters like insects. Even in the Coral Sea, where American carriers had fought the Japanese to a strategic draw, Zero pilots claimed kill ratios that seemed impossible: 5, 6, sometimes 7 American aircraft for every Zero lost. The psychological impact was devastating. American pilots, trained to believe in the superiority of their equipment and tactics, found themselves afraid. Not the normal fear of combat, which every warrior carries, but a deeper fear that they were simply outmatched, that the enemy had a weapon against which American technology had no answer. Some pilots began inventing superstitious tactics, refusing to engage Zeros unless they had overwhelming altitude advantage. Others requested transfers from fighter squadrons, unable to face the thought of another engagement with the Japanese fighters. The myth of the Zero grew with each battle, taking on an almost supernatural quality in pilot ready rooms and carrier wardrooms, and the Japanese knew it. Intercepted communications revealed that Zero pilots had been briefed extensively on the psychological advantage their aircraft gave them. They were instructed to engage American fighters whenever possible, to demonstrate their superiority, to break American morale through repeated defeats. Some Zero pilots began to showboat, performing aerobatic maneuvers during combat, demonstrating their total confidence. After shooting down an American fighter, some would perform a victory roll directly over American positions, a gesture of contempt that burned itself into the memories of those who witnessed it. This was the context in which Sanders and his team examined the captured Zero that morning. This was the weight of expectation and fear that rested on their work. 7 months into the war, American fighter pilots needed an answer. They needed to understand this machine. They needed to find its weakness. Because if the Zero truly had no weakness, if Japanese engineering had genuinely created an invincible fighter, then the long road to Tokyo would be paved with an unacceptable cost in American lives. The story of how this particular Zero came to rest on a California airfield was itself a tale of fortune and tragedy intertwined. The aircraft had been part of the air group aboard the carrier Ryujo, assigned to the Aleutian Islands campaign, a diversionary operation timed to coincide with the attack on Midway. On June 4, 1942, the same day American dive bombers were setting Japanese carriers ablaze at Midway, this Zero had participated in strikes against Dutch Harbor, Alaska, the westernmost American military installation. The pilot's name was Tadayoshi Koga, a petty officer first class with experience dating back to the China campaign. By all accounts, he was competent, careful, and dutiful. On his second sortie over Dutch Harbor, American anti-aircraft fire found his aircraft. Not a direct hit, the Zero was too agile for that, but near-miss fragments punctured his engine and severed a fuel line. Koga reported the damage to his flight leader and turned for the emergency landing site designated for just such circumstances. Akutan Island, a remote, uninhabited rock in the Aleutians, where the Japanese had scouted a relatively flat meadow suitable for emergency landings. What Koga could not see from his cockpit was that spring melt had turned that meadow into a bog. The wheels of his Zero touched down softly, perfectly controlled, and immediately sank into the mud. The aircraft pitched forward, slamming Koga's head against the instrument panel. The nose crumpled. The propeller blades bent back. And Koga, following training that had been drilled into every Japanese pilot, tried to destroy his aircraft to prevent capture. But he was dazed from the impact, perhaps concussed. He managed to set small fires in the cockpit, but the marsh water quickly extinguished them. Then, attempting to exit the inverted aircraft, Koga's parachute harness caught on the canopy rail. Unable to free himself, with water rising around his face, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga drowned in 3 feet of marsh water. Still trapped in his aircraft, on an island so remote that no rescue would ever have come even if he had survived. His body remained in the cockpit for 5 weeks, an American. Patrol vessels spotted the aircraft during a routine reconnaissance mission on July 10th. The crew couldn't believe their eyes, an intact Zero barely damaged, sitting in the marsh like a gift from the war gods themselves. Recovery operations began immediately. A team of Navy engineers and Seabees constructed a makeshift causeway through the marsh, carefully excavated around the aircraft, and then, with extraordinary care, lifted it free. Koga's body was removed with military honors. He was, after all, a warrior who had died doing his duty. The Americans buried him on Akutan Island with full military rights, a gesture of respect between fighting men that would become rarer as the war's brutality deepened. The Zero was crated, loaded onto a transport ship, and sent to Naval Air Station North Island, where the Navy's test and evaluation facilities could give it proper examination. It arrived with mud still caking its undercarriage, salt corrosion beginning to form on its aluminum skin, and Koga's blood still staining the instrument panel. But it was intact, airworthy with minor repairs, the only complete flyable Zero in American possession, and now 3 men stood before it in the fog, preparing to unlock its secrets. Sanders began his examination with the engine. The Zero's power plant was a Nakajima NK1C Sakai 12-14-cylinder radial engine, producing approximately 940 horsepower. On paper, this was significantly less powerful than American engines. The Wildcat's Pratt & Whitney R1830 produced 1,200 horsepower, and newer American fighters boasted even more. Yet the Zero could outclimb and outmaneuver American fighters despite this power deficit. The answer became clear as Sanders and the engineering team began weighing components. The entire Zero airframe, empty of fuel and ammunition, weighed just 3,500 pounds, less than 60% of a Wildcat's empty weight. The engineers looked at each other in disbelief. They weighed it again. The same result. This fighter weighed as much as a civilian light aircraft. Every component told the same story of obsessive weight reduction. The aluminum skin was thin, so thin that a man could dent it with a firm push of his thumb. The fuselage longerons were minimal, just enough structure to hold the aircraft together under positive G-forces. The wings, though long and broad, were built with such light internal structure that an engineer could lift one end by himself. The landing gear was delicate, designed only for the weight of the aircraft and nothing more. The wheels were small, the tires narrow. Everything was stripped to the absolute minimum necessary for flight. Sutherland climbed into the cockpit to test the controls and immediately noticed the lack of resistance. American fighters had heavy controls, requiring significant muscle to maneuver at high speeds. But the Zero's stick moved with alarming ease, almost loose in his hands. The ailerons responded to the slightest touch. He pushed the stick forward, and the elevator surfaces moved with such quickness that he could imagine the nose pitching down violently in flight. This was not a stable gun platform like American fighters. This was a pure flying machine, responsive to the smallest input, demanding constant attention but rewarding skilled pilots with almost telepathic control. Then he looked behind his seat. Nothing. No armor plate. He ran his hand down the seat back, feeling only thin aluminum and fabric. A single bullet striking this seat would kill the pilot instantly. He examined the fuel tanks visible through inspection panels. Standard metal tanks, no self-sealing bladders, no protective foam, no redundant systems. A single incendiary round in these tanks and the entire aircraft would become an inferno. The oxygen system for high-altitude flight consisted of a simple bottle and regulator, no backup. The hydraulics for the landing gear were a single system, no redundancy. Lundstrom made notes as the engineers called out their findings. No armor behind the pilot, 0 pounds saved. No armor around the fuel tanks, 0 pounds saved. No self-sealing fuel tanks, 150 pounds saved. No armored windscreen, 30 pounds saved. Minimal radio equipment, 40 pounds saved. Light ammunition load, 70 pounds saved. Thin aluminum skin throughout, 300 pounds saved. Minimal internal structure, 200 pounds saved. The list went on and on. Every protective system that American designers considered essential, the Japanese had eliminated. Every redundancy that might save a pilot's life removed. Every ounce of weight that didn't directly contribute to flight performance stripped away. The result was an aircraft that achieved through lightness what American fighters achieved through power. The Zero's power-to-weight ratio was exceptional despite its modest engine. With 940 horsepower pushing only 6,000 pounds at maximum takeoff weight versus 1,200 horsepower pushing 9,000 pounds for the Wildcat, the Zero had a significant advantage. It could climb at nearly 4,000 feet per minute, almost double the Wildcat's rate. It could turn inside any American fighter with ease, its lightweight and large wing area allowing it to sustain turns that would bleed speed from heavier aircraft. But the cost was written in absence. The absence of protection, the absence of safety margins, the absence of any forgiveness for mistakes or bad luck. Over the following days, the testing intensified. Navy test pilot Lieutenant Commander Bud Beasley took the Zero up for its first American flight on September 20th, 1942. The flight test report he filed afterward would change American fighter tactics forever. Beasley noted that the Zero handled beautifully at low speeds, feeling almost glued to the sky, able to maintain controlled flight at speeds that would stall American fighters. The controls remained responsive even as the airspeed indicator dropped below 100 miles per hour. He could pull the nose up to ridiculous angles and the Zero would simply hang there, defying gravity before gently settling. This explained how Zero pilots could appear suddenly in a dogfight, having bled off speed in a tight turn that would have sent an American fighter into a stall spin. At medium speeds, the Zero was magnificent. Beasley put it through a series of aerobatic maneuvers, loops, rolls, Immelman turns, split S reversals, and the aircraft responded instantly to every input. The turn rate was extraordinary. He established a sustained turn at 200 miles per hour and timed a complete 360-degree circle at 20 seconds. A Wildcat took twice that. The Zero could turn inside American fighters so quickly that a pilot who tried to turn fight would find himself being shot at before he completed half a turn. But at high speeds, weaknesses emerged. Beyond 300 miles per hour, the Zero's controls became heavy, increasingly difficult to move. The ailerons in particular required significant force to deflect at high speed. Beasley attempted a high-speed roll and found it sluggish, taking several seconds to complete where an American fighter would snap through instantly. He tried a high-speed dive pullout and felt the stick require both hands to move against the aerodynamic forces. The Zero's light control surfaces and lack of hydraulic assistance, which made it so responsive at low speeds, became a liability when the airstream pressed against them with greater force. More critically, the Zero's light structure meant it had a relatively low dive speed limit. Beasley pushed it into a steep dive and watched the airspeed indicator climb past 350 miles per hour. The aircraft began to shake. Rivets popped audibly. The wings flexed visibly. He pulled back at 380 miles per hour, and the entire airframe groaned with stress. American fighters could dive at 450 miles per hour or more, their heavy structures absorbing the stress with minimal complaint. But the Zero, built so light, simply couldn't handle the structural loads of high-speed flight. This was the key insight. The Zero owned the slow-speed fight. It owned the turning fight. It owned the climbing fight. But it could not compete in the high-speed regime. An American fighter that maintained speed, that refused to turn fight, that used diving attacks and zoom climbs, could negate almost all of the Zero's advantages. Beasley landed after his first test flight and walked directly to Sanders with a smile. "We can beat them," he said. "They've built an incredible machine for one specific fight. We just have to refuse that fight and impose our own." The tactical revelations emerging from the Zero testing arrived at precisely the moment when American carrier forces needed them most. Throughout the late summer and fall of 1942, as fighting intensified around Guadalcanal, the captured Zero was flown repeatedly against American fighters in mock combat trials. Every carrier fighter squadron in the Pacific received urgent tactical bulletins based on these tests. The guidelines were clear and specific. Never attempt to turn fight a Zero. Never engage in a slow-speed dogfight. Never allow yourself to be drawn into the vertical maneuvering game the Zero pilots preferred. Instead, American pilots were instructed to maintain altitude advantage, to attack in high-speed diving passes, to use their superior diving performance to escape if the Zero turned toward them, and then to zoom back up using their energy advantage, ready for another pass. The tactic was called boom and zoom, and it leveraged every American advantage, while avoiding every American weakness. The manual that accompanied these bulletins was explicit about the Zero's vulnerability. The Zero fighter has no armor protection for the pilot. The fuel tanks are not self-sealing. A short burst of .50 caliber fire striking the fuselage or wings will likely result in fire and destruction of the enemy aircraft. However, the Zero is extremely agile at low speeds and will easily outmaneuver any attempt at dogfighting. Your survival depends on refusing the type of combat the enemy prefers and imposing combat conditions that favor your aircraft's strengths. Fighter pilots devoured these bulletins. They practiced the new tactics religiously. For the first time since the war began, they had a framework for fighting the Zero that didn't rely on luck or desperation. The psychological impact was immediate. Pilots who had been terrified of the Zero suddenly felt they had an answer. Not an easy answer. The Zero was still deadly, still flown by experienced and skilled pilots, but an answer nonetheless. The captured Zero was also flown against the new American fighters entering service. When a prototype F-6F Hellcat arrived at North Island for comparative trials, the matchup was revealing. The Hellcat was everything the Wildcat was, but more power, more speed, more armor, more guns. At 19,000 pounds maximum takeoff weight, it was more than 3 times heavier than the Zero. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, more than double the Zero's output. In mock combat, the Hellcat and Zero revealed the unbridgeable philosophical gap between them. The Zero could still turn inside the Hellcat with ease. It could still climb faster initially. It could still operate at lower speeds. But the Hellcat could dive away from any Zero, could reach speeds the Zero couldn't match, could climb back to altitude using raw power, and could absorb battle damage that would obliterate a Zero. Most critically, the Hellcat's controls remained light and responsive at high speeds, allowing it to roll and maneuver during high-speed combat where the Zero became sluggish. The test pilot's conclusion was prophetic. In the hands of a disciplined pilot who uses energy tactics, the F-6F will dominate the Zero. In the hands of an undisciplined pilot who attempts to turn fight, the Zero will kill him just as easily as it killed Wildcat pilots. But understanding the Zero's design philosophy required more than flight testing. It required understanding the culture and strategic thinking that produced it. Lundstrom and his intelligence team spent months piecing together why Japanese engineers had made the choices they did. Choices that seemed suicidal to American engineers. The answer lay in Japan's strategic position and resource limitations. Japan entered the war with full knowledge that it could not match American industrial production. The United States had 10 times Japan's steel production, 17 times its coal production, and infinitely more oil. In a prolonged war of attrition, Japan would inevitably lose. Japanese strategic planning therefore depended on a short, decisive conflict. Strike hard, seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, establish a defensive perimeter, and negotiate a peace settlement before American industry could fully mobilize. In this strategic framework, the zero made perfect sense. Japan needed maximum combat effectiveness from minimal resources. Every zero that could be produced from the limited aluminum and steel available was worth more than a smaller number of heavier, more protective fighters. If 5,000 zeros could be built from the same resources that would produce 3,000 armored fighters, then the raw numerical advantage outweighed the individual vulnerability. Moreover, Japanese naval aviation doctrine emphasized elite pilot training. Before the war, Japanese naval aviators underwent training far more rigorous and prolonged than their American counterparts. It was not unusual for a Japanese naval pilot to have 800 to 1,000 hours of flight time before his first combat mission, including extensive aerobatic training, night flying, and formation flying. These elite pilots could maximize the Zero's performance envelope, extracting capabilities that less skilled pilots could never achieve. In Japanese tactical thinking, a superbly trained pilot in a supremely agile aircraft would defeat a moderately trained pilot in an armored aircraft before the armor mattered. The engagement would be over in seconds, one aircraft flaming toward the ocean before the armor could save anyone. Therefore, invest in pilot training and aircraft performance, not protection. The samurai ethos that permeated Japanese military culture reinforced this thinking. Warriors should seek victory through skill and courage, not through hiding behind armor. This philosophy had one critical flaw. It assumed pilot losses could be kept minimal and replacement pilots could maintain the same skill level. But war seldom cooperates with assumptions. As 1942 turned to 1943 and the grinding battles around Guadalcanal consumed both sides, the weakness in Japanese thinking became apparent. Japan's elite naval aviators, the men who had struck Pearl Harbor and rampaged across the Pacific, began to die. Not in dramatic, furious battles, but in steady attrition. One plane lost here, two there, an ace shot down, an experienced flight leader lost at sea. And unlike the Americans, who could draw on a vast pool of potential pilots and a training infrastructure that could rapidly expand, Japan's pilot training pipeline was narrow and slow. Replacing an elite pilot with 1,000 hours of training took years. Japan didn't have years. They needed pilots now immediately to replace combat losses. Training standards were reduced. Flight hours were cut. Advanced aerobatic training was abbreviated. New pilots entered combat with 300 hours of flight time instead of 800, then 200 hours. Then, by 1944, some replacement pilots would arrive at their squadrons with barely 100 hours, having never fired their guns at a maneuvering target, having never practiced recovery from an inverted spin. And these less skilled pilots were flying Zeros, aircraft that offered no forgiveness for mistakes. An American novice pilot in a Hellcat might survive his first few mistakes, protected by armor, saved by self-sealing fuel tanks, given a second chance by his aircraft's toughness. A Japanese novice in a Zero would die from his first mistake. The aircraft that had been perfect for Japan's elite pilots became a coffin for inadequately trained replacements. The captured Zero revealed this tragedy in its engineering choices. American engineers examining the aircraft kept remarking on how well it was built for what it was. The workmanship was excellent, the design clever, the manufacturing quality high given Japan's more limited industrial capacity. This wasn't a crude aircraft rushed into production. This was the product of careful thought and skilled implementation. But it was designed for a specific war, a short war fought by elite pilots, and that war had failed to materialize. Instead, Japan found itself in a long war of attrition, the very scenario its entire strategy was meant to avoid. And in a war of attrition, the Zero's lack of protection became not just a tactical weakness but a strategic disaster. American pilot losses could be replaced. American aircraft losses could be replaced, but Japanese losses, whether of pilots or aircraft, became increasingly irreplaceable. By mid-1943, American naval aviators noticed the change. The Zero pilots they faced were less aggressive, less skilled, making mistakes that earlier pilots never would have made. The psychological advantage had reversed. American pilots now hunted Zeros with confidence, using their tactical knowledge to exploit every weakness. The aircraft that had terrified them in 1942 had become prey by 1943. There was a deeper symbolism in the contrast between the Zero and American fighters, a symbolism that Sanders and his colleagues couldn't help but recognize. The Zero represented efficiency born of scarcity. Every design choice spoke of limited resources carefully marshaled, of having to extract maximum capability from minimum material. It was a machine born of necessity, clever and capable, but ultimately fragile. American fighters represented abundance. When Grumman engineers designed the Hellcat, they didn't have to agonize over whether to include armor or self-sealing tanks. They included both, and then added more guns, more ammunition, more radio equipment, more of everything, because American industry could provide it. The Hellcat entered service weighing 3 times what a Zero weighed, not because American engineers were less skilled, but because they could afford to add protection and capability without worrying about material constraints. This contrast reflected the broader industrial reality of the war. Japan began the Pacific War with 63 million people, a steel production capacity of 7 million tons annually, and virtually no domestic oil. The United States had 130 million people, 75 million tons of annual steel production, and vast domestic oil reserves. The Americans could afford to build not just fighters, but thousands of fighters, and could afford to make each one survivable and maintainable. The captured Zero sat in its hangar surrounded by American abundance. The hangar itself was a casual display of industrial capacity, a steel structure larger than many Japanese aircraft factories, housing dozens of aircraft. With electric lighting, hydraulic lifts, compressed air systems, and machine tools that Japanese facilities would consider precious assets. The test pilots flew the Zero, then climbed into Hellcats and Corsairs that cost more to build than 10 Zeros, without anyone worrying about the expense. Fuel flowed freely. Ammunition was expended without concern. If the captured Zero was damaged during testing, American engineers would simply repair it using spare parts manufactured with trivial effort. Sanders recognized this symbolism and included it in his reports. The Zero was a magnificent achievement of engineering under constraint, he wrote. Perhaps the best possible fighter that could be designed given Japan's resource limitations. But it was also proof that courage and skill could not indefinitely overcome material disadvantage. The samurai spirit that Japanese propaganda celebrated meant nothing against an enemy who could absorb losses and return stronger, who could afford to protect his pilots and still field superior numbers. This was the crucial lesson of the captured Zero, beyond tactics and engineering. It demonstrated that modern industrial warfare was ultimately decided by economic capacity. The better machine, the braver pilots, the cleverer tactics, all these mattered in individual battles. But wars were won by the side that could build more machines, train more pilots, and sustain operations longer. The Zero had been designed for a war Japan needed to win quickly. The Hellcat was designed for a war America could win eventually, and eventually was arriving faster than anyone in Tokyo had believed possible. As testing continued through 1943, American engineers began exploring ways to exploit specific Zero vulnerabilities. The most significant was its complete lack of protective armor. Tests were conducted firing various weapons at captured Zero components to determine the most effective ammunition types. The results were striking. A single 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary round striking a Zero's fuel tank would produce catastrophic fire within seconds. The unprotected tank would rupture, fuel would spray across the hot engine, and the entire aircraft would be engulfed before the pilot could react. Multiple hits were unnecessary. One solid strike was typically fatal. Similarly, fire directed at the cockpit area was almost always instantly lethal. The thin aluminum skin provided no resistance to 50-caliber rounds, which would pass through the fuselage, through the pilot, and out the other side. Even 30-caliber rounds, the lighter machine gun ammunition, would easily penetrate the cockpit area. Zero pilots had no protection whatsoever except their skill at not being hit. American pilots were briefed on these findings. The tactical guidance became even more specific. Aim for the fuselage or the wings where fuel tanks were located. Short bursts were sufficient. A 1-second burst from 650 caliber machine guns would place enough rounds on target to guarantee a kill if the aim was true. Don't waste ammunition in prolonged firing. Get a good position, fire one accurate burst, and the Zero will burn. The flip side was also communicated. If you allow a Zero to get into firing position on you, your armor and self-sealing tanks will likely save you from the first burst, but not from sustained fire. Therefore, the priority remains not getting hit at all. Use tactics that prevent the Zero from achieving a firing solution. Don't rely on your protection to save you. Rely on your speed and tactical discipline to avoid being shot in the first place. This guidance created an interesting psychological dynamic. American pilots knew their aircraft were tougher, but they also knew that toughness was a backup system, not a primary defense. The captured Zero testing had revealed vulnerabilities, but it had also reinforced that the Zero was still lethal if it could bring its guns to bear. Confidence increased, but not overconfidence. Respect for the enemy aircraft remained, but fear diminished. By late 1943, the captured Zero was showing its age. Repeated test flights, mock combat engagements, and engineering examinations had taken their toll. The airframe accumulated stress cracks. The engine began consuming excessive oil. Parts worn out and, ironically, American maintenance crews struggled to fabricate replacements to Japanese specifications. The decision was made to retire it from flight testing and preserve it for technical examination and training purposes. But by then, the Zero's secrets had been thoroughly exposed. Every American carrier fighter squadron had tactical bulletins derived from the testing. Flight training incorporated Zero-specific defensive and offensive tactics. Gun camera footage from actual combat was analyzed using knowledge gained from the captured aircraft, allowing American intelligence to better understand Japanese tactics and potential countermeasures. More captured Zeros arrived as the war progressed. Each one examined, some restored to flight, others studied structurally. But that first aircraft, Koga's Zero, recovered from Akutan Island, remained the most significant. It had arrived at the crucial moment when American fighter pilots desperately needed answers. It had provided those answers completely and comprehensively, and it had shifted the psychological balance of the air war from Japanese advantage to parity, then gradually to American advantage. The impact on combat statistics was measurable. In 1942, the kill ratio between Zeros and American carrier fighters averaged approximately 3-to-1 in favor of the Zero. By mid-1943, the ratio had reached parity. By 1944, American pilots were destroying Zeros at ratios exceeding 5-to-1. Some of this shift was due to better American aircraft. The Hellcat entered combat in late 1943, followed by the even more capable F-4U Corsair. Some was due to declining Japanese pilot quality as elite aviators were killed and replaced with less trained pilots. But a significant factor was improved American tactics derived directly from captured Zero testing. American pilots learned to treat the Zero as a specific tactical problem with specific solutions rather than as an invincible opponent. They learned the precise altitude band where they held advantage, the exact speed range where the Zero became vulnerable, the specific maneuvers that would expose a Zero to attack while keeping the American fighter safe. This knowledge, distributed throughout the Pacific Fleet's air wings, transformed combat outcomes. The engineers and pilots who examined the captured Zero also gained insight into the mindset of their opponents. The aircraft was a window into Japanese military thinking, revealing priorities and assumptions that helped American intelligence better predict Japanese actions. The Zero's design spoke of an offensive mindset. Everything was optimized for reach, endurance, and combat effectiveness. The aircraft could fly for 6 hours with drop tanks, giving it enormous operational range that allowed Japanese carriers to strike from distances American carriers couldn't match early in the war. The lightweight meant it could operate from smaller airfields, from carriers with shorter flight decks, from improvised jungle strips, where heavier American fighters would become bogged down. But this offensive capability came at the cost of defensive weakness. The Zero had minimal armor, minimal redundancy, minimal ability to sustain damage. This revealed that Japanese planners expected to maintain offensive initiative, to strike first and strike decisively, to avoid situations where their aircraft would be shot at extensively. It was the strategic thinking of an aggressor who believed the war would be fought on their terms. American fighters, by contrast, were designed with the assumption that they would sometimes be on the defensive, that their pilots would take damage, that not every mission would go according to plan. The armor and self-sealing tanks weren't just protective measures. They were admissions that combat was unpredictable and pilots needed survival margins. This defensive thinking wasn't weakness. It was realism about the nature of war. As the Pacific War progressed and Japan was progressively pushed onto the strategic defensive, the Zero's design philosophy became increasingly mismatched to the operational reality. Japanese fighters found themselves intercepting American bomber formations protected by dozens of Hellcats and Corsairs, fighting defensive battles where they were outnumbered and outgunned, where their agility advantage meant little against the massed firepower of American escorts. The Zero pilots would slash through the escorts brilliantly, their aircraft performing as designed, but then a single return burst from a Hellcat would send them down in flames, their lack of protection proving fatal. The symbolism was impossible to miss. Japan had designed its fighters for the war it wanted to fight, a short, decisive offensive campaign. America had designed its fighters for the war it might have to fight, a long, grinding campaign where survival and sustainability mattered as much as performance. Reality favored the American assumption. There was one more element to the Zero's story that emerged from the testing, something that went beyond tactics and engineering. It was found in the small details, the human touches that revealed who had built and flown these machines. When American mechanics first cleaned the captured Zero's cockpit, they found personal items that Koga had carried. A small photograph, damaged by seawater but still recognizable, showed a young woman in traditional dress. His wife, perhaps, or a sister. A good luck charm on a leather cord, inscribed with characters that the Navy's Japanese translators identified as a prayer for safety. A letter never mailed, written in the careful hand of someone who knew they might not survive to write another. These items were treated with respect and eventually returned to Japan through neutral diplomatic channels after the war. They were human reminders that the enemy were not monsters or machines, but men who loved and feared and hoped, just as American pilots did. Men who had been given a magnificent but unforgiving machine to fly into battle. Men who had died in service to their nation, whether their cause was just or not. Sutherland. The combat veteran who had lost friends to Zero pilots kept a small notebook throughout the testing program. In it, he wrote observations about the aircraft and his own evolving thoughts about the enemy. One entry, written after his first flight in the Zero, read, "Today I flew the machine that killed Jimmy over Wake. I expected to hate it. Instead, I understand it. Some engineer in Japan designed this aircraft with the same care and skill that American engineers put into our planes. Some mechanic maintained it with pride. Some pilot flew it with courage. They weren't superhumans. They were just men doing their jobs, given a machine that asked everything of them and forgave nothing. I'll fight them without hesitation, but I'll never again think of them as anything less than fellow warriors." This perspective spread among the American pilots who flew against or examined the captured Zero. The mystique evaporated, replaced by professional respect. The Zero became not a feared unknown, but an understood adversary. Dangerous, certainly, but no longer mysterious. And in war, the mysterious is always more frightening than the merely dangerous. The final flights of the captured Zero occurred in December 1943, 18 months after its recovery. By then, the aircraft had contributed everything it could to the American war effort. It had been flown by dozens of test pilots, examined by hundreds of engineers, studied by thousands of pilots through film footage and briefings. Its influence had spread across the entire Pacific theater, changing how Americans fought and how they trained to fight. On its final flight, Sanders himself took the controls. He had been present for its first American flight and wanted to be present for its last. He took off into a clear California sky, the same sky that Koga would have seen over Japan, the same sky that connected all men who took to the air in that era. He climbed to 10,000 feet and put the Zero through its paces one last time. The graceful rolls, the effortless climbs, the tight turns that seemed to defy physics. He felt what Koga must have felt, the thrill of piloting a machine that responded to the smallest input, that flew as if thought itself was sufficient to guide it. But he also felt the vulnerability. Every buffet of wind reminded him that only thin aluminum separated him from the slipstream. Every engine vibration reminded him that no armor stood between him and enemy fire. Every control input reminded him that this aircraft was optimized for perfect conditions and punished any mistake. It was beautiful and deadly, magnificent and fragile, triumph and tragedy built into the same aluminum frame. He landed smoothly, taxied back to the hangar, and shut down the engine for the last time. The propeller coasted to a stop. The ticking of hot metal gradually faded. In the sudden silence, Sanders sat for a moment in the cockpit that had been Koga's last seat, and offered a silent acknowledgement to the Japanese pilot who had, through misfortune, given the Americans the intelligence victory they needed. The captured Zero was eventually sent to multiple locations for preservation and display. Parts were distributed to training facilities where new pilots could see firsthand what they would face. The fuselage was retained for structural testing, stress analysis, and materials research. But pieces of that first captured Zero, Tadayoshi Koga's aircraft, found their way to museums and memorials, where they remain today as artifacts of technological competition and human cost. In the decades after the war, historians and engineers continued to analyze the Zero's design and the impact of its capture. The consensus emerged that the captured Zero had shortened the Pacific War by several months, perhaps longer. The tactical knowledge gained allowed American pilots to engage Zeros more effectively immediately, saving American lives and accelerating the attrition of Japanese air power. The psychological boost to American morale was incalculable. The engineering insights influenced American fighter design for years afterward, teaching lessons about the limits of weight reduction and the necessity of pilot protection. Japanese engineers after the war acknowledged that the Zero's lack of protection had been a critical flaw, one they had recognized but felt unable to rectify given Japan's strategic situation. Some proposed armored versions, but adding protection meant adding weight, which meant reducing performance or requiring more powerful engines, which Japan couldn't produce in sufficient quantities. They were trapped by the same resource constraints that had driven the original design. Later Japanese fighters like the J-2M Raiden and N-1KJ Shiden attempted to address these shortcomings with armor and more powerful engines, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the trajectory of the air war. The Americans, by contrast, simply built better fighters using their industrial advantages. The Hellcat and Corsair weren't revolutionary designs. They were evolutionary improvements using proven concepts, built tough and built in massive numbers. More than 12,000 Hellcats were built, more than 12,000 Corsairs. The Zero, despite being in production longer, totaled approximately 10,000 of all variants. American industry simply overwhelmed Japanese production while simultaneously producing superior individual aircraft. This industrial reality, perhaps more than any tactical or technological factor, decided the Pacific Air War. But the captured Zero accelerated the process by months or years. It allowed American pilots to survive long enough to gain experience, to develop tactics, to become veterans who could train the next wave. It prevented the psychological collapse that might have occurred if the Zero had remained, mysterious and unbeatable through 1943 and into 1944. It provided concrete proof that American fighters, properly flown, could win. The story of the captured Zero resonates because it illustrates fundamental truths about modern warfare that extend far beyond any single battle or weapon system. It demonstrates that technological superiority is contextual, not absolute. The Zero was superior in certain performance parameters, but inferior in others, and victory went to the side that could impose combat conditions favoring their strengths. It shows that doctrine and tactics matter as much as hardware. The same American pilots flying the same Wildcats became far more effective once they understood their opponent and adapted their approach. It reveals that transparency and knowledge are force multipliers. The captured Zero gave American forces something invaluable: understanding. That understanding spread through tactical bulletins, training programs, and pilot conversations, multiplying its impact across the entire theater. One captured aircraft ultimately affected thousands of combat engagements by informing the pilots who flew in them, and it demonstrates the crucial role of sustainability and industrial capacity in modern war. The Zero was optimized for maximum performance from minimum resources, a reasonable approach for a nation with limited industrial base planning a short war. But when the war extended beyond Japan's planning horizon, that optimization became a liability. American fighters were designed with margins of protection, margins of performance, margins of maintainability, that allowed them to sustain operations through a long war of attrition. Those margins seemed wasteful in peacetime but proved essential in war. The engineers who examined the captured Zero understood these lessons intimately. They saw in its beautifully minimalist design a kind of desperate brilliance, the work of talented people trying to achieve maximum effect with inadequate resources. They recognized that in different circumstances, with more materials and more time, Japanese engineers would certainly have designed differently. The Zero wasn't inferior engineering, it was engineering under severe constraints. But American engineers also understood that they had the luxury of working without such constraints, and that luxury translated directly into saved lives. Every American pilot who survived because armor stopped a bullet, because self-sealing tanks prevented fire, because a tough airframe held together despite battle damage, each of those survivors was a dividend paid by American industrial capacity. The money spent on extra metal, on protective systems, on overbuilt structures, was money spent on bringing pilots home alive. And pilots who survived could fly again, could teach others, could gain experience that made them deadlier against the enemy. In the end, the captured Zero told a story of two different philosophies meeting in combat. Two different nations' answers to the same question: how do we build a fighter aircraft? Japan answered with elegance and efficiency, creating a machine of stunning performance that asked everything of its pilot and forgave nothing. America answered with abundance and pragmatism, creating machines that protected their pilots even at the cost of pure performance, betting that survivable adequacy would defeat excellent fragility. History vindicated the American approach, but not because the Japanese approach was foolish. In a short war fought by elite pilots with limited objectives, the Zero's design philosophy might have succeeded. But the Pacific War was not short. The elite pilots did not remain elite forever, as attrition took its toll, and American industrial capacity ensured that limited objectives were never achievable. The strategic assumptions underlying the Zero's design proved incorrect, and no amount of engineering brilliance could compensate for flawed strategy. The Americans who examined the captured Zero recognized this. They praised its design even as they exploited its weaknesses. They respected the pilots who flew it even as they killed them. They learned from it even as they built machines to defeat it. The captured Zero became a teacher, inadvertently educating its enemies in how to destroy it and its kind. This was the ultimate irony. The weapon system that had terrorized the Pacific became the key to its own defeat. Tadayoshi Koga, dying in the mud of Akutan Island, could not have known that his aircraft would betray every secret of Japanese fighter design to the enemy. He died believing he had failed to destroy his machine, but that his failure would be temporary, that the vast emptiness of the Aleutians would keep his Zero hidden until Japanese forces could recover or destroy it. Instead, his failure became one of the most significant intelligence coups of the Pacific War. His Zero, preserved by the very remoteness that made his death certain, taught the Americans everything they needed to know. There is no dishonor in this outcome. Koga was a warrior who died performing his duty. His aircraft was a triumph of engineering given the constraints under which it was designed. The Japanese pilots who flew the Zero fought with skill and courage throughout the war. But courage and skill cannot indefinitely overcome industrial disadvantage and strategic miscalculation. The captured Zero proved this in the most concrete possible way. Decades after the war, survivors from both sides met at reunions and commemorative events. Former Zero pilots and former American fighter pilots would sit together, old men now, and discuss the machines they had flown and the battles they had fought. The Zero pilots would express something between pride and sadness when discussing their aircraft. Pride in its capabilities, in the victories they had achieved, in the pure flying joy it had given them. Sadness for the friends who had died in flames because that magnificent machine offered them no protection. American pilots would acknowledge that fighting the Zero had been terrifying in the early war, that it had taken months to develop tactics that worked, that even late in the war, a skilled Zero pilot in the right circumstances could be deadly. They would speak with respect about Japanese airmanship, about the courage it took to fly an unarmored fighter into combat, knowing that one bullet could be fatal, and both sides would acknowledge the role of the captured Zero in changing the course of the air war. Japanese veterans would say, with the frankness that age and distance from the conflict allowed, that losing that intact fighter to the Americans had been a disaster, that it had given their enemies the knowledge needed to counter their primary air superiority weapon. American veterans would agree, noting that the captured Zero had been worth more than a carrier in terms of its impact on the war's outcome. In these conversations, the humanity that military propaganda had obscured during wartime would reassert itself. They had been enemies, trying their utmost to kill each other, and many of their comrades had died in that effort. But they had also been fellow members of a small fraternity, men who had flown in combat, who had experienced the terror and exhilaration that only combat aviation provides, who understood each other in ways that those who had not fought could never quite grasp. The captured Zero, in this context, became more than a weapon or an intelligence asset. It became a symbol of the shared experience of war, the technological competition between nations, and the human cost of that competition. Every man who flew it or fought against it carried memories of young pilots who had died, of friends who had not returned, of the arbitrary nature of survival in aerial combat. The machine itself was neither good nor evil. It was simply a tool, brilliantly designed for a specific purpose, used by men on both sides doing what they believed was their duty. Today, surviving Zeros are displayed in museums around the world, carefully preserved artifacts of a specific moment in aviation history. Visitors stand before them, often surprised by how small they seem, how delicate their construction appears. The aluminum skin, so carefully formed 8 decades ago, shows the passage of time, restored sections next to original panels, the patina of age on metal that once flew through Pacific skies. The rising sun emblems on the fuselage evoke a lost empire, a war fought and concluded generations ago. Museum placards explain the Zero's specifications, its victories, its ultimate defeat. They note the capture of intact examples and the tactical intelligence gained from their examination. They mention the kill ratios, the combat statistics, the technological evolution that led from the Zero to jets and beyond. These facts are accurate and important, the historical record of technological and tactical competition. But standing before an actual Zero, one can sense something beyond the statistics. The cockpit is tiny, barely room for a pilot and his instruments. The seat is thin, uncomfortable looking, without the padding American pilots enjoyed. The instruments are simple, functional, minimal. Everything speaks of a design philosophy that prioritized the mission over the pilot's comfort or safety. Climb into that cockpit, even just mentally, and imagine flying it into combat. No armor behind you, fuel tanks that will explode if hit, a structure that will disintegrate under heavy fire, and the courage required becomes palpable. This was what American test pilots felt when they first flew the captured Zero. Respect for the machine, certainly, but also a profound recognition of what Japanese pilots faced every time they took off. American pilots knew that if they made a mistake or had bad luck, their armor might save them, their tough airframe might hold together, their self-sealing tanks might prevent fire. Zero pilots knew they had no such margins. Every flight was a test of skill, and any failure could be fatal, yet they flew anyway. Thousands of them, throughout the war, knowing the risks, accepting the vulnerability, trusting in their training and their aircraft's performance to keep them alive. Many died, shot down by increasingly skilled American pilots using tactics derived from the captured Zero, but they flew the missions assigned to them, defended their carriers and their homeland, fought with everything they had despite knowing that the war was increasingly lost. This, too, is part of the captured Zero's story. Not just the tactical intelligence it provided, not just the engineering insights it offered, but the human dimension it revealed. Wars are fought by people, and those people deserve recognition for their courage even when their cause was flawed, their strategy mistaken, their defeat inevitable. The captured Zero taught the Americans how to fight. It revealed vulnerabilities and suggested tactics. It transformed fear into understanding and understanding into confidence. It accelerated American aerial victories and shortened the Pacific War. These are measurable, documentable effects, the quantifiable impact of a single intelligence coup. But it taught something else, something less measurable but perhaps more important. It taught that respecting your enemy's capabilities is essential, that understanding their tools is crucial, that war is won through knowledge as much as courage. It demonstrated that technological advantage is contextual and conditional, that the best weapon is the one that matches strategic reality, not the one with the most impressive specifications. It showed that industrial capacity and sustainability matter more than individual brilliance in prolonged conflict. These lessons extended far beyond the Pacific. War. The principle of capturing and examining enemy equipment became standard practice, leading to programs that acquired and tested Soviet aircraft during the Cold War, that analyzed Iraqi weapons after the Gulf War, that continuously assess potential adversary capabilities today. The recognition that pilot protection matters, that survivability is a force multiplier, influenced fighter design permanently. No modern fighter is built as lightly or as unprotected as the Zero, regardless of performance advantages that might bring. The captured Zero thus stands at the beginning of a tradition of competitive technical intelligence that has shaped military aviation ever since. Every captured enemy aircraft, every defector who brought their machine to the other side, every technical assessment of adversary capabilities, all these trace their lineage back to that June morning in 1942 when Sanders first laid his hand on a captured Zero's aluminum skin and began to unravel its secrets. The fog had burned off by afternoon on that first day at North Island. Sanders stood again before the Zero, his examination complete for the day, his mind filled with observations and questions. The setting sun painted the fighter's aluminum skin orange and red, colors that evoked fire, the fate of so many of these machines. Around him, engineers and pilots debated what they had learned, what tests should come next, what tactical recommendations should be made. But Sanders was silent, thinking about the pilot who had last flown this machine, thinking about Koga, who had followed his training perfectly, made a textbook emergency landing, and died in the attempt to destroy his aircraft, thinking about how war turns small mistakes into tragedies, how a decision made in seconds determines whether someone lives or dies, how chance and circumstance matter as much as skill or courage. He thought about the intelligence value of what they had captured, yes, but also about the human cost behind that value. Every secret learned from this aircraft would help Americans kill more Japanese pilots. Every tactical advantage gained would translate into more Zeros shot down, more young men dying in flames over the Pacific. This was necessary. They were at war, and winning required killing the enemy. But it was not something to celebrate thoughtlessly. The captured Zero was a victory for American intelligence, a breakthrough that would save American lives. But it was also a tomb, marked by the rising sun emblems on its fuselage, dedicated to all the young men on both sides who would die before the war ended. It was a teacher, but the lessons it taught were written in blood. It was a machine, but it represented human choices. Japanese engineers choosing performance over protection, American engineers choosing abundance over efficiency, pilots on both sides choosing to fight even knowing they might not survive. As Sanders walked away from the hangar that evening, he carried with him the beginning of understanding that would eventually spread across the Pacific Fleet. Understanding of the Zero's capabilities and limitations. Understanding of how to fight it effectively. Understanding that would shift the balance of the air war from uncertain to inevitable. But he also carried questions that would remain with him long after the war ended. Questions about the price of knowledge, about the meaning of victory, about what it means to defeat an enemy you've come to respect. The captured Zero would provide many answers in the months ahead. Tactical and technical answers that would be measured in combat victories and enemy aircraft destroyed. But some questions, Sanders knew, had no answers that statistics could capture. Some truths about war could only be felt, standing in the twilight before a captured fighter, with the weight of past battles and future costs pressing equally on the mind. The Zero would teach Americans how to win the air war. But it would also teach to those willing to learn something about the complexity of that victory, the courage of those defeated, and the human dimension that exists even in the most technological of conflicts. These lessons, perhaps, were the most important of all. They are the lessons that survive when the tactics are obsolete and the technology is ancient. They are why we preserve these artifacts, display them, study them, and tell their stories. Not just to remember who won or lost, but to understand what was at stake, what was sacrificed, and what it cost to prevail. The captured Zero stands for all of this. Victory and tragedy, brilliant engineering and fatal flaw, the beginning of understanding and the cost of that knowledge. And in the end, that is the story worth telling. Not just how Americans learned to defeat the Zero, but what they learned about war, about enemies, about themselves in the process of that victory. The aluminum and rivets may fade, the witnesses may pass, but the lessons endure, as relevant to understanding conflict today as they were in the smoke and fire of the Pacific War 8 decades past.